Though they had left family, friends, and all that was familiar to them, Amos and Ann were welcomed into a new type of family as they joined Zion's fold in Utah. After arriving in Salt Lake City on September 5, 1866, Amos and Ann went to 226 B Street in Salt Lake, where Aunt Miriam Clarke, Amos's half-sister, had built a home as she had been there for nearly 2 years. Shortly thereafter, they were able to find a large, unfinished house with no windows and no floors. This served as a place of shelter and rest after the long journey, but it was not very inviting to spend the winter on a dirt floor. Amos and Ann found a better house before winter set in, and they moved into it. It was located in the 19th Ward on B Street, between Apricot Street and Currant Street in Salt Lake City. Amos had no trouble getting employment in Salt Lake, as blacksmiths were in great demand. Among other things, he did the ironwork on a homemade threshing machine, which was built in the shop of Naylor Brothers. They had great happiness over the arrival of a baby boy, Amos Richard Edward, on December 12, 1868. Just 17 days later, on the 29th of December, 1868, they had great sorrow with the death of the oldest son, Moses. Moses was 14 years old. It is unsure whether he died of a ruptured appendix or cholera. Anne said that she washed the new baby many times with her tears after the death of Moses. News was sent to Salt Lake that a blacksmith was needed in Newton, which was to be opened to settlement. In the spring of 1869, Amos went to Newton and worked at his trade. He brought his daughters Annie and Sarah to cook for him. Annie would have been about 11 years old, and Sarah would have been about 9. Amos got some of the early settlers to build a log house for them. Some say that it was the first house in Newton. It was about 18 feet by 20 feet, with a lean-to on the north side, which was about 10 feet by 20 feet. This was all covered with a dirt roof. It was on the southwest corner of Block 12 in Newton, Cache County, Utah. The blacksmith shop had been built next to the sidewalk and a little farther north of this log home. In the fall of 1869, John Godfrey and Franklin D. Young went by team to the October LDS conference in Salt Lake City. Godfrey and Young brought the rest of the Clarke family back to Newton with them. Since there were no older sons, the daughters, Annie, Elizabeth, and Sarah, and Mary, helped Amos in all his work, milking cows, helping in the hay, going to the creek to help get willows to burn, and any other work the family needed done. Amos was not paid in full for his work in Salt Lake City. However, through the efforts of Kimball Brothers, he received as part payment a span of bay horses weighing 1,250 pounds each. They were considered quite desirable as an addition to the farming community where oxen were the main means for travel. The horses were named Dan and Bob. They pulled a wagon with wheel rims that were 3 1/4 inches wide, and were used to bring Amos and Ann's possessions from Salt Lake City to Newton. Amos and Ann's son, Lemuel George, was born there in 1871. Amos used his homestead right to take up a quarter section of land on the south side of town. He divided it into 10-acre fields to sell to settlers. His preemption right was used for a quarter section on the north side of town, and it was divided into 5-acre fields and sold to settlers. In 1885, when Amos wanted a quarter section of land, he had no more right to use for it, so William F. Rigby, Jr. used his homestead right for them. He was Amos's son-in-law. William was a freighter in Idaho and Montana, and felt he did not want to be a farmer. Amos made a cash entry and proved up on the land early. Amos got 2 10-acre fields on the south side of town and 10 acres on the north side, which he rented to some of the neighbors as he had no chance to work on it on account of working in the blacksmith shop. The first years spent in Newton were lean ones. There was plenty of work, but drought, insects, and pests caused crop failures or very light crops, leaving farmers with very little to pay for work. Farmers wanted their blacksmith work done cheap and to have time to pay. This made it difficult for the Clarke family to get along. The map here shows where the Clarke family house was located in Newton. When the Oregon Short Line Railroad enlarged their shops in Logan, Amos Clarke was engaged by that company. While working in Logan, he lived with the family of William Knowles. In addition to being a blacksmith, Amos was a metal worker as well as an ironsmith. After working in Logan for the railway for a few years, the railroad shop burned down. Amos was transferred to work in the shops in Battle Creek, Idaho. He did not stay there long. About 1875, the United Order started a foundry in Logan on South Main Street, just below the hill where the Smith Brothers lumber yard is now located. They needed a blacksmith, and Amos was asked to go there to work for about 2 years. The family remained in Newton, and he came home for the weekends. Nearly every Saturday during the summer months, he worked in the blacksmith shop until after midnight, sharpening plowshares and tools for the farmers of Newton. It was while Amos was working in Logan that he met Evan Stevens. The Stevens family had immigrated from Wales after being converted to the gospel. They lived for a time in Willard, but then moved to Malad. Working on the railroad brought Evan from Malad to Logan. There he worked as a striker with Amos Clarke. A striker would hold the metal that the blacksmith was working on. Even though Evan did not like blacksmith work, they shared a love of music, and they both taught music in a railway car. They had a little organ and taught note notation and all rudiments of music to children. Also, they sang in a choir in one of the wards, under Alexander Lewis as the choir director. Evan Stevens went on to be the second director of the Mormon Tabernacle Choir during its transition to become a nationally recognized choir. After moving to Newton, 4 more children were born to the family. Lemuel George was born in 1871. Eliza Josephine, who died at birth, was born in 1873. Samuel was born in 1874, and David was born in 1876. Anne's son George made this statement about his mother.
Mother had a great responsibility of directing and looking after us boys while Father was away working in the railroad shops, and we learned to love and respect her for it. She was once confronted by an Indian while Father was away, and although she was very frightened, she had been taught not to show fear, and she stood up to him. He left after she had given him some food.
At the time of the birth of his youngest son, Amos was a tall, stalwart man with broad shoulders, dark brown hair, blue eyes, fair skin, and a pleasant smile. He was confident in his ability to accomplish a task, sure of himself. Amos dressed well. His clothes always seemed to fit. He was straight as an arrow. His muscles were firm and strong, and his hands were large with long fingers. The muscles developed through constant use in welding. His stride was resolute and sure. From about 1877 on, Amos was able to stay in Newton full time. Even though the grasshoppers were still bad, the crops began to improve, and the farmers were beginning to earn a living on their land. In Amos's life, this verse from the Book of Mormon would have been so important. For the Lord shall comfort Zion. He will comfort all her waste places, and he will make her wilderness like Eden, and her desert like the garden of the Lord. Joy and gladness shall be found therein, thanksgiving and the voice of melody. Amos and Anne worked all their lives to make the desert into a garden of Eden and bring music to the hearts of the saints. In 1877, Amos became the second choir leader in Newton, with a choir of about 20 members. He purchased a Mason and Hamlin organ from one of Brigham Young's families and brought the first organ to Newton. He often hauled his organ to the schoolhouse so the choir could put on concerts. Several of these concerts helped raise funds to purchase an organ that was installed in the new meeting house in the 1890s. He bought an organ for the Newton ward on January 5, 1892. The new organ arrived at Cache Junction on January 17, 1892. It took 10 days to come from Chicago, which was a remarkable feat for those days. He also bought a cover for the new organ, 4 yards of tablecloth. The material he purchased cost 65 cents a yard. Amos labored nearly 40 years as chorister in the Newton Sunday School and the ward choir. He had a good taste in the selection of songs, and always liked words to suit the occasion. He sat up night after night by the light of a coal lamp, copying the music as well as the words. For every song he taught the choir. They did not have money for books. This copying took a great deal of time. During winter, he would travel by sleigh from town to town to teach the children the songs of Zion in preparation for the Sunday Jubilee. These were sometimes held in Logan, then alternating to Newton, Clarkston, and Weston.
Granddaughter Lula Rigby described the Jubilees this way. Amos would go from Newton up to Preston to all the little towns and teach them the Jubilee songs. In June they had a big Jubilee, and all these choirs would come together and sing. A Jubilee was a gathering of all the ward choirs. The choir would learn the songs separately in their home ward. Amos would teach them the songs. Then the choirs assembled in Logan all together for a big sing-out. Jubilees were held once a year.
Many times his daughters would travel with him and sing in the choir when he went from town to town. This would help the others learn the music faster. Mary had a beautiful soprano voice, and Sarah sang alto to bring out the harmony. Sarah used to tell this story. After she was married and expecting her fourth child, she thought that she should stay home instead of traveling around the valley. When she mentioned this to her father, he just looked at her and said, "Sarah, you will go." Then Sarah would laugh and say, "Sarah went." Later, sometime before 1883, a rock house was built for the family of Amos Clarke. It was north of the blacksmith shop. Amos had tie rods installed through the upper floor from wall to wall to keep them secure. Then he put great big A's at the end of the tie rods, one A for Amos and the other A for Anne. The Clarke family had to go to Logan to buy coal, and there was very little of it brought over in the early days. In later years, when the railroad came through Bear River Canyon about 1890, there was a station built at Cache Junction, making coal more available. When they were boys, Amos Jr. and George went with Mark and Sam Benson to Logan Canyon to do some logging at Crowther's mill. The mill sawed the logs and took hay from their share, giving Amos Jr. and George half of the lumber. The brothers got lumber to build a barn and other outbuildings shown in this picture. Much of their other spare time was spent going to the mountains north of Clarkston to get firewood, mostly mahogany, to keep the family warm during the winter. It required 2 days to get a load, and they always found company to go with them in case of an accident. George Clarke shares his experience.
One time when Amos Jr. and I had 2 teams up there, I had just started to cut mahogany when a piece dropped with the branches down, holding the butt end up in the air, and it swayed down in the way of the axe, as I started to cut another piece. The axe was deflected into my foot and made quite a deep cut into the instep. We stopped the blood and bandaged it up good, and there was other company there with Amos Jr. They hitched up my team and sent me home. There were some holes in my old hat, and we tore some of it up to put it in the cut to stop the bleeding, but I made the trip home okay.
Amos was a very civic-minded person, and always helped with the roads, reservoir, and community projects where he was needed. He held the office of school trustee for 10 terms. Also, he was a precinct justice. He was the constable and caretaker of the Stray compound from June 10, 1890 to January 21, 1892. At first, the public square in the center of town was called the Stray compound. This was used to gather the cows from the town so they could be taken out to pasture by a herder. Later, however, the public square was made into a place of beauty as the schoolhouse and new church. He was also the justice of the peace in the Newton precinct, Cache County, Utah, in 1890. In 1893, he was elected as a delegate to the Democratic County Convention. He was acting bishop in the time of the Crusade. It may have been that the bishop was arrested for polygamy, and because Amos Clarke was not a polygamist, he was called to act as the bishop for a length of time. Pictured here is Amos Clarke's signature, as found in one of his books. Amos was an active member of the church in Newton. One service that Amos performed for the ward was his attending all general and Sunday school conferences. Amos would go down to Salt Lake, attend the conferences, and then the next week report what he had learned to the congregation in Newton. Another one of Amos's great callings was in Sunday school. We know of his service through the choir book that he kept from 1894 to 1898. He kept a record of every song that was sung and the meeting that it was sung in. He also recorded the special programs that were held, such as the 4th of July and missionary farewells. In this book are the records of trios by the Clarke brothers, Amos Jr., George, and Samuel, and also quartets of Amos Sr., Amos Jr., George, and Samuel. Then there are listings of grandchildren who sang in the duets, trios, and choruses. Amos relied on George to play the organ for the hymns at church. On occasion, in the choir book there would be the notation that there was no choir practice because the choir leader was spending time at the temple. Amos was devoted to temple work and spent much time there. He would go over to Logan to spend 2 or 3 days in the temple and then return home. From 1894 to 1895, Amos went back to Wales to gather genealogy. Even though the travel was now done by steamship and railroad car, Anne would not go because of her memory of the hard trip before. George Rigby, Amos's son-in-law, was serving a mission in the Manchester Conference, and was allowed to travel with Amos while he visited relatives and gathered family names. Amos visited with his brothers, sisters, extended family, and many friends from his old hometown. This is his brother Edward. He had always hoped that some of his family would listen to the gospel, and so before he returned to America, he left some money in the mission headquarters in Liverpool, with the instructions that if any one of the family would visit them in Utah, there would be enough money for a ticket. While he was in Wales, he wrote an article for the Rose Herald. It was reprinted in Logan's newspaper, The Journal, on March 5, 1895. In the article, he strongly defended the gospel and living in Utah. Amos Clarke wrote a hymn that was published in the hymn book of the church. It was published in 1909, when Joseph Fielding Smith was the president of the church. In honor of Amos, a group of his descendants sing, "Hark, the children sweetly sing," the hymn which Amos wrote.
Hark, the children sweetly sing, praises to their Savior King. See them come in bright array, children of the latter day. Hark, 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 the children sweetly sing. Hark, 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 the children sweetly sing. Loud hosannas, loud hosannas, to their Savior and their King. See their numbers, how they swell, to what greatness who can tell? Zion's children strong are they, who their onward course can stay. Hark, 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 the children sweetly sing. Hark, 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 the children sweetly sing. Loud hosannas, loud hosannas, to their Savior and their King. Come and join this happy throng, join them in their holy song, train them in the path of right, doing good is their delight. Hark, 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 the children sweetly sing. Hark, 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 the children sweetly sing. Loud hosannas, loud hosannas, to their Savior and their King. Zion's children bright and fair, they the kingdom soon shall bear. May they always worthy be of this glorious destiny. Hark, 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 the children sweetly sing. Hark, 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 the children sweetly sing. Loud hosannas, loud hosannas, to their Savior and their King.
When Amos's son George left for his mission to Wales in November of 1896, Samuel played the organ for the hymns. Olive Beck also played quite often. Olive and Samuel were married, and later Samuel left on his mission. Music was such an important part of the lives of the Clarke family. While George Clarke was serving his mission in Wales, he had several people in Ross tell him that they were lucky to have an axe that was made by Amos Clarke. On September 6, 1898, Samuel arrived in England. He was also assigned to the Welsh Conference. George had permission to go to North Wales to meet him. They spent the month of September visiting with various relatives, holding meetings, and tracting in the area of North Wales. They were able to attend Aunt Hannah Clarke's funeral in Wales on October 8, 1898. On Thursday, October 20th, 1898, they received word that Samuel was the father of a baby boy, Cyril, who had been born on October 6th. This news was received with great joy. The brothers worked together until December of that year. Then George was released from his mission. He bid his brother Samuel goodbye with tears in his eyes, thinking that they were parting for a long time. Little did he know that it would be the last time he would see his brother alive. On Thursday, September 21st, 1899, at 8:30 p.m., the family heard about a cablegram that was sent to President Snow, stating that Samuel Clarke had died while on his mission at Cardiff. The family was grief-stricken. Indeed, the whole town was shocked and saddened by the news. They learned later that Samuel had died of erysipelas. His body was shipped from Wales, and the funeral services were held on October 31st, 1899. Especially sad is the fact that Samuel Clarke was never able to see his young wife again, nor had he ever seen his baby son, Cyril. In 1904, Sephora Jones, the granddaughter of Anne's brother George Johnson, decided to take the offer of her Uncle Amos and come to America for a year's visit. There was much sickness in Wales and England, and she was afraid that she would get it and die as one of her friends had done. She traveled to America with a group of saints returning to Utah. In her descriptive life story, we gain much insight to the lives of the Clarke family.
August 10th, 1904. We arrived in Newton safe and sound, where I met Auntie Anne and Uncle Amos, and Martha, David's wife, and their 2 children, Vella, 3 years, and Doral, 6 weeks old. I was received very graciously by Uncle and Aunt. Auntie shed a few tears when she saw me, and she looked me over from head to foot, and told me how brave I was to come so far. The table was set and a hot supper ready on the stove. The living room was spotlessly clean. The American cook stove took my eye. It was so shiny you could see your face in it, with lots of chrome trim. Uncle Amos was a very devout Mormon, so we knelt for family prayer before we ate. The plates were turned face down on the table, which was new to me, and turned over when we sat up to the table. The dinner was good, but I couldn't eat much. After supper was cleared away, we visited a while. Then David and Martha and the children left for home across the lot. Then I was introduced to my sleeping quarters, which was down a narrow hall where the stairway was and a front door. There was an east and west room on each side. I was to have the east room downstairs. It was a good-sized room, with a stove and washstand with a big jug and bowl, a table, a couple of chairs and a bookcase, and sofa and bed. When I saw the bed, I wondered how I was going to be able to climb into it. The mattress was so thick. It was a straw tick mattress filled with fresh oat straw, set on a spring frame. The bedstead was of wood, so I wondered if it had bed bugs, but Auntie said, "I will give you $5 for every bed bug you find in my beds or anywhere." The folks slept in the west room and George upstairs. The rock house was built on the pattern of the old country houses, with 3 rooms up and 3 rooms down. There was not hot and cold water taps at that time, no bathrooms, and the outhouse was down the lot, quite away from the house. The water was pumped out of the well, which was outside of the back porch, and there was a little cellar where the food and milk was set for the cream to raise for butter. The floors were all covered with homemade carpet, made of carpet rags and woven into rugs, which was laid over straw several inches thick. The beds were covered with lovely homemade wool-filled quilts over the sheets, which were made of unbleached sheeting. Lindsay was used for sheets in winter, but it was coarse and scratchy, and later outing sheets were used.
Persis Rigby, granddaughter of Amos and Anne, describes the homemade carpet this way. When we used to make homemade carpets, we had to cut it at the length we wanted it for the room. It was in strips a yard wide. I had gone with Mother, Sarah, to help her sew the carpet for one of Grandma Clarke's big rooms. Then we would have to bind the ends to keep it from raveling.
Again, we quote from Sephora.
It was grain harvest time, and George had 2 weeks' vacation from his office in Murray. Uncle Amos was an early riser and figured everyone else should be. So about 7 o'clock he came to my bedroom door and started to sing, "Get up early, time is precious, waste it not in bed." So up I got, though I felt like I could have slept all day. But everybody was astir. The boys had all the milking done and had breakfast. Amos Jr. and David and a crew of men had left for the ranch, which was 2 miles out of town, and the work started at 7 o'clock. Uncle was a renowned blacksmith and had his blacksmith shop. He was not a farmer. Auntie did most of the cooking for the crew. Both were in their 70s, but she had hired a couple of her granddaughters to help her. Cousins Letty Rigby and Ida Jenkins were there to help put up the dinner, which had to be taken up to the ranch by 12 o'clock, enough to feed 18 men who were cutting and threshing the grain. I thought I had never seen so much food for one meal in my life, and all hot, too. It took 2 big tin tubs to pack it in, with dishes and knives and forks, everything to serve for dinner with fruit, cake, and pie for dessert. George hooked up 2 horses to a surrey and loaded the 2 tubs of food in, and off we started. He wanted me to see the ranch and how the grain was harvested. It was a rough road to the ranch, all dirt and dust, and open water ditches for irrigation water, which made it rough riding in and out of the ditches. Wild, open country. I thought we'd never get there alive, but we did, and I met the crew, mostly relatives. There was an old well on the ranch, and they all washed their hands and dove in the victuals, and slicked it all up in a hurry. Amos Jr., David, and George stacked the dishes back in the tubs for us to take back home, ready for the next meal. It was all so new and different to me. We stopped long enough to see them go back to work. They hooked up 9 teams of horses up to the thresher, and they were driven round and round in a circle to thresh the grain, and it was sacked and sewn and put in piles. The grain that year was so heavy they could hardly cut it. It yielded 50 bushel to the acre. Being dry farm grain, it was ripe enough to be cut and threshed at the same time. But the next year after I came, they had headers to cut the grain and a steam thresher. The Jenkins brothers bought the first steam thresher, so they didn't use as many horses. The Larson brothers also bought one. On our way back, we went to the Newton Cemetery, which to me looked like a wilderness, for me to see where Samuel was buried. It seemed so sad, and we shed a few tears. There was a lovely white marble stone at the head, with white doves and the music notes of the words, "How great the wisdom and the love," that filled the courts on high, and a box with an artificial wreath under glass, with a funeral card inside. He died in September 1899, and this was August 11th, 1904. Harvest time was a busy time. At 6 p.m. the horses were unhitched, fed, and watered, and all hands came down for a wash and a hot supper. The washpans, soap, and towels were put on the back porch. There was a little room called a shanty, where the cooking was done to keep the living room cool, if possible. The girls and Auntie had been cooking all day, more cakes and pies and bread. It took a lot to feed all those men. The table was opened out to full size, with a nice linen tablecloth, and all hands sat around and dove into the food. It was soon slicked up, pie, cake, and all. The same pattern was set and went on until their wheat harvest was over. Then the men moved on to other farms. The first thing I noticed on my first morning in Newton was the beauty of the East Mountains. They were the Smithfield Mountains. I gazed all over the little town of Newton. There weren't too many houses. Every one had a barn, or lean-to, and outbuildings. All places were fenced in, as everyone had cattle roaming around. Everybody had a well. If you needed water, they pumped it, or raised it up in a bucket, and there was always a dipper hung by the well. Uncle Amos's rock house was the largest finished house in the little town. The roads were wide with big irrigation ditches on each side, with weeds 3 to 4 feet high. There were huge trees of poplar or cotton growing on the ditch banks, and a few sycamores, so they lent beauty to the town. They were very green and beautiful at the time of year, so I felt that Newton was a pretty place, but so different to where I had come from. Wales was an old country, and this was so new, with dusty roads everywhere. I asked Auntie who planted the beautiful trees, and she told me she had planted all of them on their street herself.
Sephora's account captures Anne and Amos's legacy of devotion and hard work. Their family had come a long way since immigration. They'd worked hard to establish a full life in Utah.